When I first moved into my new place by the lake, I thought I had found peace. The water was calm, the view was beautiful, and it finally felt like home. But almost as soon as I unpacked the last box, the hoe came storming in, clipboards in hand, demanding explanations and pushing rules I had never even heard of. At first, I thought it was just a friendly visit to welcome me to the neighborhood, but it became clear they weren't there to bring cookies or shake hands. They had their eyes on the lake. The way they talked, you'd think they owned it. They insisted the docks lining the water were community property, used for decades by residents under HOA control. But what they didn't realize, or maybe what they were trying to ignore, was that I had done my homework. Every dock, every inch of that shoreline was written into my deed. Legally, it all belonged to me. The tension was instant. Imagine moving into what you believe is your dream home, only to be told, by people you've never met, that the very lake you bought, the one you were so excited to enjoy, somehow wasn't yours to claim. They pressed harder, telling me I had no right to keep others from using the docks. I pushed back with the paperwork in hand, but they weren't backing down. That first confrontation set the tone. It wasn't about a small rule or a neighborly disagreement. It was about control and who really had the right to decide what happened on that lake. And as their demands grew louder, I realized this fight was just beginning. Because when the hoe wants something, they don't let go easily. And what they wanted was my lake. I didn't move to the lake on a whim. I had spent months searching for the right property, something private and peaceful, away from all the noise. When I found this house, tucked against the water with its own shoreline and multiple docks, it felt too good to be true. I made sure everything was in order before I signed: survey maps, property lines, even the original agreements from decades ago. Every document made it clear. The lakefront and the docks were mine. That's what gave me confidence walking into this place. What I didn't expect was that the hoe had been treating my property like their own backyard for years. Neighbors later told me that before I moved in, people would come down to the lake freely. Families tied up their boats, kids swam off the docks, and no one ever questioned it. The problem was, it was never theirs to begin with. The previous owner didn't live here full-time and hardly enforced boundaries. So when I arrived, ready to finally enjoy what I legally purchased, it must have felt like I was cutting them off from something they thought belonged to everyone. Still, the way the hoe came at me was shocking. It wasn't a polite request or a friendly conversation. It was demands, almost as if they were daring me to challenge them. They spoke about community rights and long-standing traditions, but not once did they mention actual legal ownership. That's because they couldn't. Every time I looked back at my paperwork, I knew the truth. Yet, their confidence made me wonder just how far they were willing to push. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. This wasn't just about docks. This was about power. And the hoe wasn't finished with me yet. The first week after that confrontation, the atmosphere around the lake shifted. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel eyes on me. Neighbors who once waved politely now avoided contact, or worse, whispered as I walked past. It was as if the hoe had already painted me as the outsider, the one standing in the way of their lake. The strange part was, some people didn't seem angry at me at all. A few even hinted that they had been tired of the HOA's control for years but were too scared to speak up. That told me this fight was bigger than just the docks. One evening, as I was locking up my boathouse, a man from down the road stopped by. He told me quietly that the hoe had used those docks for decades to host their events, fishing tournaments, even private parties. It wasn't just about boating. It was about money and influence. Apparently, the hoe collected fees for people who wanted to use the lake, even though it never belonged to them. Hearing that made everything click. If I enforced my ownership, they stood to lose not just access, but their grip on the community. At the same time, I started noticing small things. Flyers slipped into my mailbox about community traditions, comments from board members about how newcomers should respect established rules. It all seemed like a subtle campaign to push me into giving in. But each reminder only made me dig in deeper. What unsettled me most was how organized they were. This wasn't a casual disagreement. It was a calculated effort. And with every passing day, it felt less like a neighborhood dispute and more like a battle line being drawn across the lake. What I didn't know yet was just how far they were willing to go to keep control. The pressure only grew heavier as the weeks went on. Every home meeting seemed to turn into a debate about me, even when I wasn't in the room. Neighbors told me they'd overheard board members talking about taking back the docks and making sure I understood my place. It was strange, this lake, which I had bought fair and square, suddenly felt like the center of a storm I couldn't escape. Then came the letters. Not official notices, just strongly worded demands slipped into my mailbox. They claimed I was disrupting community life by limiting access, that I was breaking long-standing agreements. But when I asked for proof of these so-called agreements, no one could produce a single document. It was all talk, all intimidation. And yet, the tone of those letters hinted at something bigger coming. The tension finally reached a boiling point one Saturday morning. I had gone down to the water to check the docks after a storm when I saw a group of home members gathered near the shoreline. They weren't there to chat. Clipboards in hand, cameras ready, they walked onto the dock as if they owned it, pointing, measuring, muttering about safety violations. The sight of them marching across my property lit a fire in me, but I held back, watching carefully. This wasn't a random visit. They were building a case, piece by piece, to try and strip me of my rights. By then, I knew this wasn't going to end quietly. The HOA wasn't just testing boundaries. They were pushing me toward a breaking point. And as I stood there, staring at them on the very docks I owned, I realized the real showdown was coming. The question was no longer if, but how far they would go to try and take my lake. Just when I thought I had seen the worst of their tactics, the HOA pulled a move I never saw coming. One afternoon, I received a letter not from them, but from the county. According to the notice, there had been a formal complaint filed against me for improper use of the lake and unsafe dock maintenance. My heart sank as I read the words. This wasn't just neighborhood pressure anymore. They had dragged the local authorities into the fight. I knew immediately where the complaint had come from. The timing was too perfect, lining up exactly with the day they had shown up on the docks taking photos and scribbling notes. They hadn't just been bluffing, they had been preparing ammunition. And now, instead of a simple property dispute, I was facing the possibility of inspections, fines, and legal headaches, all designed to wear me down. But here's where it got even stranger. When I looked deeper into the records, I discovered something unexpected. The HOA had been submitting lake management reports to the county for years, acting as if they were the rightful owners. They had built an entire paper trail, presenting themselves as the ones in charge, even though my deed clearly proved otherwise. That explained their confidence and why so many neighbors believed their version of the story. The realization hit hard. They weren't just challenging me in the open. They had been quietly rewriting the narrative long before I ever moved in. If I didn't push back, their version of ownership could easily become the accepted truth. Standing on the dock that evening, staring out over the water, I couldn't help but wonder, had I underestimated them? Because it was no longer just about neighbors disagreeing. This was about an HOA that had the power, the influence, and now the county's attention on their side. And I knew the fight was about to reach a whole new level. The county inspector arrived a week later, clipboard in hand, ready to look over every dock and shoreline. The HOA members gathered at a distance, watching like they were about to see me get shut down. I'll admit, my nerves were running high. But I had prepared for this moment. I handed the inspector every deed, survey, and legal document I had collected. Page after page proved the same thing. The lakefront and the docks were mine. The inspection itself was quick. The docks were sturdy, safe, and well-maintained. There were no violations, no safety concerns. When the inspector turned back toward me with a nod of approval, I could feel the eyes of the HOA burning from across the water. Their plan had backfired. Not only was I cleared, but the inspector even confirmed that the county had no record of the HOA ever owning or managing the lake. All those reports they had been submitting were baseless. That should have been the end of it. But then came the twist I never saw coming. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached me quietly. They admitted they had been pressured for years into paying lake fees to the HOA, even though the board knew they had no legal right to collect them. Some families had handed over thousands of dollars. Suddenly, the conflict wasn't just about me. The truth had cracked open something much bigger, a history of control and intimidation that had gone unchecked for too long. The Ho had stormed in demanding my lake, certain they could push me out. Instead, their own scheme had been exposed. I had defended my property, but now the entire community was asking new questions. The fight for my lake was over, but it had sparked a reckoning no one saw coming. In the weeks that followed, everything around the lake began to change. The Ho, once so loud and confident, suddenly went quiet. With the inspector's report and the evidence in my favor, they had no ground left to stand on. Neighbors who once looked at me with suspicion started stopping by, some to apologize, others to share their own stories of being pushed around by the board. It became clear that this fight wasn't just about my docks. It was about years of people feeling powerless against a group that had overstepped its authority. Little by little, the tension eased. Families who had avoided me before began to ask if they could still enjoy the lake, this time with my permission, not under the HOA's thumb. I didn't mind sharing the space, as long as it was done respectfully and honestly. For the first time since moving in, the lake actually felt like what I had hoped for, a place of peace, not conflict. As for the Ho, they were forced to answer questions they had avoided for years. Some board members stepped down, and talk of restructuring began. The so-called lake fees they had collected became a serious topic in community meetings, and neighbors started pushing for accountability. It was a reminder that sometimes it only takes one person standing firm to unravel years of unfair control. Looking back, I realized this whole battle had taught me more than just how to defend my property rights. It showed me the importance of knowing the facts, standing your ground, and not letting intimidation win. The Ho stormed in demanding my lake, but in the end, I not only kept what was mine, I helped open the door for change in the entire community. And that was worth every ounce of the struggle.